It's been more than 2 years since the murder of George Floyd. On May 25, 2020, officers responded to a street corner after a store clerk reported Floyd using a counterfeit $20 bill to buy cigarettes. In the encounter, Floyd is approached by officers and is eventually handcuffed and put in the back seat of a patrol car. He resists, saying he feels claustrophobic, and goes to lie down on the pavement, still handcuffed. After this, 3 officers pin him down across separate areas of his body. One of these officers is white, Minneapolis cop Derek Chauvin, who kneels on Floyd's neck for 9.5 minutes. During this time, a growing crowd of bystanders pleads with officers to stop what they're doing. Floyd becomes unresponsive and is pronounced dead later that evening. Shortly after, video of the disturbing incident is posted online and goes viral. In a matter of days, protests and riots erupt in Minneapolis and across the world, reigniting the Black Lives Matter movement. In the months following, it seemed like change was finally happening. However, fast forward to today, and the number of police killings of African Americans remains at similar rates over the past 3 years. In fact, this population is nearly 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people in the U.S., according to the nonprofit research organization Mapping Police Violence. This leaves many people asking themselves, what real progress, if any, has been made since Floyd's death?
I think the answer is the progress is mixed. And unfortunately, that just happens to be a byproduct of having a criminal justice system that is operated mostly on the local level.
That's Daniel Harawa, an associate professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis. He emphasizes that the federal government has little jurisdiction over state and local authorities. This means that policing initiatives can vary widely across the country. Following summer 2020, Harawa says that many police agencies did change certain responses, one of them being the no-knock warrant.
Which, if you may recall, was the type of warrant that was issued in Breonna Taylor's case, where police essentially can barge into a house without any kind of notice, which ostensibly creates just a more dangerous situation for everyone involved. And so a lot of jurisdictions, not only across the country, from the South to the North to the West to the Midwest, have rethought the use of no-knock warrants. And so I do think there has been real movement that we just didn't see before the summer of 2020.
Another policy that's come under question is qualified immunity, which absolves police officers from civil liability even if they violate a person's constitutional rights.
So one of the problems we see with police misconduct is that police officers often aren't held criminally responsible for using force, including deadly force against people. And so one of the alternative avenues for relief that people turn to are civil suits, lawsuits for money damages for the violation of your rights. And there's this doctrine, qualified immunity, that essentially absolves police from liability absent kind of the most egregious violations of rights. And some jurisdictions, such as Colorado, for example, have gotten rid of state-level qualified immunity, so saying that officers aren't immune from lawsuits and have to go to trial just like anyone else for the violation of rights, which again, before 2020, those kinds of conversations at the state level weren't happening as robustly as they're happening now.
Another aspect of change centers around traffic stops. Janice Iwama is an assistant professor in the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology in the School of Public Affairs at American University in Washington, D.C. She's also a consultant to D.C. police agencies, helping them to incorporate new policing initiatives to fight implicit bias. Iwama says several jurisdictions have been rethinking strategies for traffic stops. For example, police officers in Philadelphia and Los Angeles don't pull over drivers anymore for secondary types of offenses, such as registration expirations or missing tags.
Those are the types of things we're starting to consider ourselves. Well, should police officers be pulling people over for that? Is that really necessary? Or should we really focus on those crimes that really could create some type of chaos, some type of violent incident, such as speeding, And so many agencies are starting to have these conversations is why don't we remove officers from pulling people over for simply having a registration expired, and rather focusing on more of the serious crimes such as speeding that really could lead to a loss of lives. And so because we have this concern with so many individuals of color who are being pulled over for these low-level offenses that are resulting in the use of excessive force, is why don't we change that type of policing practice, which really, when we think about what effectively reduces crime, that's not it, right? We really should be focusing on the more serious crimes.
For jurisdictions that do pull people over for secondary offenses, Iwama suggests that police officers collect data about the person's race to create greater awareness about the role of implicit bias in these stops.
So many agencies perform traffic stops, but don't necessarily collect information on race. So a lot of the work that I do engage with agencies on is why don't we start collecting this information on who the officer perceives that individual is, whether they happen to be white, Black, Latinx, or Asian, trying to categorize that information, collect that data, so we can then over time look at, are there large racial disparities and where exactly are they? Are they at outcomes on whether an individual gets a citation versus a warning? Or do we find individuals of color are more likely to be searched, for example?
And not all new policies are agreed upon. A new Arizona law that goes into effect this September restricts the public from filming police activity from within 8 feet or closer. According to court testimony, the young woman who recorded George Floyd's murder on her phone was standing at the rear of the police vehicle when it happened. The clip she took from that vantage point went viral and became a key piece of evidence against the former cop, Derek Chauvin. While proponents of this new Arizona law believe it promotes police and civilian safety, civil rights advocates believe it reduces transparency.
If you yourself or the community from which you come from hasn't really been the target of certain kind of aggressive, violent, deadly police practices, then you may not see it as being as much of a problem as other communities. And in fact, if you think about the summer of 2020, what it shed light on had been happening forever. It wasn't anything new, but still it was a really important moment to wake people up and to increase national consciousness. And so just as that moment and that summer was necessary to kind of open people's eyes, I still think there's much more education that needs to be done in order to get greater buy-in from across various segments of the population.
The way forward is neither clear nor certain. However, Harawa says it's crucial that all Americans continue to push for police reform and equal treatment across the board. You can learn more about this topic and past stories by visiting our website at viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio engineer is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
The refugee resettlement program in this country expects refugees to achieve self-sufficiency within 90 days.
The immense challenges of building a new life in an unfamiliar place. Then,
the scale of sugar production, the scale of these land estates that we call plantations was vastly ramped up, and that enslavement became, for the first time in European history, entirely racialized.
The untold narrative of early European exploitation. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.